Hello and welcome to Sociology 101 live stream. I was just sent this video, probably the last hour or so, by Dr. Matt O'Reilly, who has a connection with me, actually. He is a professor of theology at the Wesley Bible Seminary, but he's also teaches theology at Houston Baptist University, which is a part of our Texas Baptist family. And I, of course, as many of you already know, work with Texas Baptist at the denominational level. And so was honored to find out that we have a connection in this way. I put in the show notes a link to the video that I'm going to be reviewing. And here's the reason I'm reviewing this video. Several people have made comments over the last couple of years, but just recently, one of my closest friends made this comment about why we only review videos with people we disagree with. You know, he's asking that question. And I, my answer was, well, in apologetics, you're trying to, counteract something that's happening that's in the world that you disagree with. And obviously you want to push back on, for example, Dr. James White, when he puts out videos that I disagree with, that's a video I want to critique or, bring light to from the other perspective. Same thing with, Dr. Piper's daily broadcasts and things that he does, many of which I agree with, by the way, but there's some of which, obviously, when he gets into the Calvinism issues, that I take issue with. And so when I saw this video today, I thought, well, this is a perfect opportunity for me to highlight a video of another brother in Christ, a PhD nonetheless, in the Texas Baptist family, who works with Houston Baptist, as I said, who is teaching something that I thought was really clear and good. It's a 10 minutes, actually 9 minutes and 38 seconds long. So it's a good short video, unlike the review of it will be. I'm sure this one will be longer. But the reason I'm highlighting it is because I want you to know who Dr. O'Reilly is. And I want you to like and share his video. And so it's only got like 1,000 views since July. And he doesn't have that many subscribers. This is the kind of guy that should be known, I think, in the work that he's doing should be known. Why PhDs like this aren't known as well as the John Pipers of our world beats me. I don't know. I think his teaching is very clear here. What he's saying about Romans 9 through 11 is just, I think, very, very clear and indisputable. It will be disputed, I'm sure, but I find it very, very compelling. And many of you know I've written the book on the Potter's Promise, where the largest portion of the book is a verse by verse through Romans 8:28 all the way through 9. And it does obviously touch on chapters 10 and 11 as well, and reflects back on to even Romans chapter 3 with the interlocutor that we've talked about before. A lot of what you're going to hear Dr. O'Reilly talk about here is very similar to the take that I've taken, but he does it in a much shorter, much more concise and intelligent sounding way. He doesn't make up new words like I do and have a Texas twang. And well, he may have a little Texas twang. I don't know. He's a Texan. He may be a Texan guy. He teaches at Houston Baptist. He might be. But anyway, you'll I think be impressed with him. I'm watching my side chat, by the way, because I am going to be answering questions throughout this broadcast. If you tag me, you have to tag me for me to be able to see it. I can see all of them, but for example, Ezra has just said everything sounds clear. Thank you for that. Sometimes when I'm doing broadcast, I don't know if sound is coming through okay. And in just a second, when I play Dr. O'Reilly's video, if the sound is not coming through well or something is wrong, please let me know that as well. And so let's watch Dr. O'Reilly's video here, and then we will kind of pause and comment, just like we do with the videos that we disagree with. We're going to do that with a video that we actually agree with, and hopefully give some good clarity as far as what we believe and why we believe Romans 9 through 11 is really about an expanding of God's mercy and grace, not a narrowing of it. It's about missions. It's about reaching more people. It's about how God is a blessing to all the nations of the earth, not that he's reprobated most people. And so somebody's asking, can you give us the original link to the video? Yes, it's in the show notes. It's also above in the side chat. If you just scroll back up there a little bit, Flytrap, you should be able to find it. And let's tune in and watch it.
The Doctrine of Election.
Just start from the beginning.
One major point of debate among Arminians and Calvinists is the doctrine of election. Classical Arminians believe that God's election is conditioned on his foreknowledge of faith. Calvinists respond by insisting that divine election for salvation is unconditional. My name is Dr. Matt O'Reilly of orthodoxyforeveryone.com, and in this video, I'll explain why the Calvinist view fails to give a satisfactory account of the biblical evidence for the doctrine of election. We'll also talk about how we need to be thinking about mission when we're talking about election in biblical perspective. If you like this content, if you find it helpful, help me out by liking, subscribing, and sharing it with your friends. Now, from the Calvinist perspective, God's choice with regard to who will be saved is made without reference to that person's faith or anything else they do. And those who are not chosen are passed over. They remain in their condemned state with no hope of salvation. The technical term in theology for this very unfortunate group is reprobate. If we want to understand what the Bible teaches about election, we need to understand what it says about the reprobate, about those who are passed over, the unchosen, the unelect. Now, to do that, we've got to go all the way back to the figure of Abraham. The initial account of God's choice of Abraham and his family comes in the opening verses of Genesis 12. That's where we discover that God picked Abraham and promised to bless him by giving him first a large family and second the land of the Canaanites. The first observation to be made is that when God chose Abraham's family to be his people, everyone else was passed over. Choosing one always means rejecting others. God picked Abraham's family. He did not pick the Canaanites. Abraham's family was the elect nation. Other nations were reprobate. The exclusive nature of God's choice is likely to trouble many. It seems very unfair. Why Abraham? Why not the Canaanites? And there are no easy answer to those questions, but neither are they the end of the story. If we want to understand what's going on, we've got to dig deeper into God's choice of Abraham's family.
Okay, before he goes on, I want to make sure you're following what he's saying here. He's acknowledging that Abraham, an individual, okay, is chosen. And the other families, they're not chosen. And so he's going to promote a corporate view of election, like I believe in. He's going to talk about that in just a minute. But one of the greatest misnomers of Calvinists coming after or critiquing our perspective, the non-Calvinistic perspective, is to say, well, it's not just about nations. Nations are made up of individuals too. So whatever's true about the nation must be true about the individuals. Or you guys aren't even dealing with individuals. Notice that Dr. O'Reilly has not avoided the fact that Abraham, an individual, is chosen here, because that's not the point of contention. Pointing out that God chose Jacob and not Esau, or pointing out that God chose Abraham or not the other families of the earth, or that God chose Isaac and not Ishmael or the other brothers, the sons of Keturah, that does not get to our point of contention. And so that's why you've got to hear us out, Calvinists. Many Calvinists have not taken the time, not all Calvinists, some Calvinists obviously engage in depth with some of these arguments, but many of the large number of resurging Calvinists on the internet today have not taken the time to really get to understand the more robust scholarly perspective like that of Dr. O'Reilly in a sufficient enough way for them to be able to rebut it in a way that I think is cogent and convincing for those that know what they're talking about. So listen to what he goes on to say. So he's acknowledging Abraham was chosen and the rest of the families were not chosen. So that kind of seems unfair. Is that right for God to do that? Is that okay? Well, listen to the rest of the story.
A second observation sets God's election of Abraham and his family in a different light by pointing to God's purposes in choosing them. Here's the key detail. God may have chosen Abraham's family instead of any other nation, but he also chose Abraham's family for the sake of the other nations. Did you catch that? God passed over other families of the earth. He picked Abraham and his descendants, but we must not fail to see that God specifically said to Abraham that he was chosen in order that all the families of the earth should be blessed. That's Genesis 12:3.
Okay, so notice the verse he just quoted, Genesis 12:3. I've highlighted this in my book. I highlight this on several videos. He says it very, very clearly here, and I totally agree with what Dr. O'Reilly is saying. He is saying God has not chosen Abraham and his family to the neglect of all the other families, but instead, as Genesis 12:3 says, I have chosen you to be the seed through which all the families of the earth will be blessed. The illustration you've heard me use before in the past is that of my children. If I were to choose one of my 4 children to take cupcakes to the other 4 children, yes, I've chosen the one child to be the bearer of good news, to be the bringer of the dessert. Okay. Does that mean that I have favored her and to the neglect of her siblings? No, it means that I've chosen her to be the blessing, the means of blessing to the rest of her siblings. Now, can her siblings reject that blessing and be under the curse of their father for rejecting the gift of their father? Of course they can. But that doesn't change the fact that the father is choosing one child to bless the rest of the children. And I've used this illustration once before, and somebody highlighted, oh, well, we're not all children of God. You're trying to think we're all children of God. Again, it's an analogy, okay? And by the way, in Acts 17, Paul does refer to all as begotten of God, in the sense that we're all created of God. We're not all born again believers in that sense, children, no, but we all are offspring of God in the sense that we are all created by God. And so that illustration does work if you're understanding the intention of the author. By the way, when you're critiquing somebody else, Dr. Stratton and I talked about this. Don't try to take the worst possible argument and make it even worse, as some people do on the internet when they're doing polemics and things like that. They try to take something somebody says and make it into the worst sounding argument that they possibly can. The better way to do good argumentation is not, instead of attacking the straw man, attack a steel man, is the way Dr. Stratton put it. And I love that. I'm going to continue to use that. And what that means is you take their argument and you make it better. You make their argument as strong as it possibly can, and then confront it. In other words, try to understand what they're saying, why they're saying it, their intentions, and assume that they're the best, and make the argument as strong as you can. I've noticed when I do this with, especially with internet Calvinists, when they'll make an argument, and I understand the argument they're trying to make. I mean, I've recognized it from scholars, and I'll even say, oh, well, what you're arguing is this argument from here's a quote from John Piper, who makes that similar argument about the 2 wills of God, for example, or something like that. And I'll say, here's how you make that argument stronger. That way I can show you, here's a critique of that strong argument, and you can understand it. So understand what Dr. O'Reilly is saying here. He's saying, yes, God did choose Abraham, but he didn't choose Abraham to the neglect of his brothers and sisters or the other families of the earth. He chose Abraham to be the means of blessing to all the families of the earth. That is a distinct difference between that and Calvinism, because Calvinism has ultimately said, oh, God's chosen certain people to the neglect of all other people. And that's not ever the way the doctrine of election is taught throughout Scripture.
God's sovereign choice of Abraham was not an end in itself. Instead, it was the providential means to the end of bringing the blessing of God's salvation to those who were initially passed over. Abraham was the prototypical object of God's electing love, but his election always carried the goal of bringing that same love to all the families of the earth. To put it in theological language, the kind of language that often characterizes the debate over divine election, Abraham's family was chosen by God in order to bless the reprobate nations. The elect are chosen for the sake of those who were not elected. And they are elect in order that the reprobate might enjoy and benefit from the blessings of God's saving work.
Okay, so he just re-highlighted what he just said. He's showing you how, by choosing this nation of Israel, how it is bringing a blessing to the rest of the nations of the world. By the way, I've just noticed that Orthodoxy for Everyone, who is run by Dr. O'Reilly, just posted on our side chat. Thanks for this. What an honor. Welcome, Dr. O'Reilly. I should have just had you come on the program. And matter of fact, let's just plan to do that some other time where we can talk through these things. The reason I did invite you on first, because I wanted everyone to hear this video first, because this video, you're so concise and you do this so well. And so thank you for what you're doing and putting this out there. And thank you for the comments on the side chat. I appreciate that. So let's keep going here.
Now this throws a wrench in the Calvinist view that election is unconditional. Take, for example, the language of the Westminster Confession of Faith. It says that the number of the elect is so certain and definite that it cannot be either increased or diminished. From this point of view, there's a firm and fixed line drawn between those God has chosen and those he has passed over. The numbers of each group are unchangeable. Only the elect will be saved, and the reprobate will necessarily be consigned to eternal torment, never knowing the joy of God's blessing. The elect...
Now, let that sink in for a second. Let that sink in, that people are ultimately chosen for reasons and factors beyond their control. And the people who are passed by are equally reprobated, chosen for damnation for reasons beyond their control. And this is the difficult the difficult pill that Calvinism you have to swallow in order to adopt Calvinism. This is why Piper talks about weeping for 3 days when first coming to understand Calvinism, because this is a very difficult doctrine. Calvin himself is even quoted as calling it a dreadful doctrine. The doctrine of reprobation is dreadful. And the fact that the scriptures never clearly and decisively teach this doctrine of reprobation, and the fact that that many quote unquote Calvinistic leaning types have even dropped the concept of double predestination, I think inconsistently and logically incoherently, but they have dropped this concept of double predestination and have just tried to adopt a single predestinarian perspective, whereby they would say, yes, God has elected unconditionally before the foundation of the earth some people for effectual salvation, but he doesn't predestine the rest to hell. He just lets them, they say, well, he just lets them go their own way. Well, and every form of Calvinism says that. What their meaning is that it lets them go the way of their nature, or according to their desires, which of course, if you remember, are just as much under the sovereign control of God as the choices of the elect to come to Christ. And so it's not really escaping the problem, especially if you're going to take Romans 9 to mean Jacob I've chosen for effectual salvation and Esau I've damned before they did anything good or bad, i.e. without any knowledge of their choice to believe or not to believe. Again, that's the way the Calvinist takes that verse. And so it's impossible, if you're going to take Romans 9 Calvinistically, to avoid double predestination. And if Romans 9 is not teaching Calvinism, then there's no reason to adopt it in the first place, because it's the main hotbed proof text for Calvinism. And so if you don't have Romans 9 anymore, then there's no reason to adopt this Calvinistic system in the first place. And if you are going to adopt it and you're going to use Romans 9 to support it, then you might as well swallow the difficult pill of reprobation, which is ultimately that God has consigned Esau before he was even born to eternal damnation for reasons beyond his control. And the obvious problems with that are the same reasons we have such detestation of racism, or putting people down because of the color of their skin or because of an ailment that they have no control over. Well, what makes racism, for example, and bigotry so detestable, or even sexism for that matter? Well, because you're judging somebody for something they don't have any control over. You're judging somebody for something that they were born with. They just had, I'm just born this color. I was just born this height. I was just born with this deficiency, or this thing, whatever it is. I have no control over it. I have no control over my gender or my hair color or my eye color or my skin color. So why would you judge somebody for that? Well, in the same vein, why would you judge somebody with a nature they were born with that they have no control over? Because for the Calvinist, nature means to be under the sovereign control of God. God controls your nature. And so to say they're acting in accordance with their nature is just another way of saying they're acting in accordance with what God has determined for them to act. And you're not escaping from the problem. So keep those things in mind as you're listening to what Dr. O'Reilly is saying, because he's giving a very concise and easily understood perspective from the two sides right beside each other. But keep in mind that the Calvinists who are supporting their view are having to swallow that difficult pill in order to take Romans 9 the way they're taking it. And we're just asking, is that a pill worth swallowing? Is that the pill that Paul is trying to get us to swallow? And if it's not, then we should find a better alternative.
On the one hand, and the reprobate on the other, are related only through contrast. One is saved, the other is lost. Given our interpretation of Genesis 12, it looks like the language of Westminster takes the doctrine of election in a very different direction from the way the Bible frames the doctrine of election, which is grounded in the calling of Abraham and the promises to Abraham. For Abraham and in his family, the elect are related to the reprobate not merely in terms of contrast, but also in terms of instrumentality. They are God's instrument, the means by which the reprobate are blessed. If it's true, as we've seen, that God chose Abraham's family for the purpose of blessing the unchosen nations, then we should resist framing election in unconditional terms.
Okay, so are you following what he's talking about? You'll see the word instrumentality used quite regularly. Matter of fact, that video that's become very popular on my site with Rabbi Zacharias, I read an article from him, which, by the way, Dr. Zacharias's ministry website does not take a stand on the Calvinism debate. He's avoided the debate altogether for the sake of his apologetic ministry being able to reach over lines with regard to those things. But this article, which was written back in the 70s, I think, goes through these things from a non-Calvinistic perspective, because he talks about the instrumentality. He talks about the reason one is chosen for the other, that he's an instrument, not of condemnation towards the other nations, but an instrument to bring a blessing to other nations. And so it's being selected for a service. Election to service is oftentimes what this is referred to. And that's not in contrast with the election, the corporate view of election, by the way, because there is a corporate aspect of election. Israel is chosen, but there are also individuals within Israel who are chosen for instrumental purposes. In other words, Isaiah is chosen as a prophet. That's an instrument of God, a voice, a mouthpiece, if you will, of God. Does that mean every single Israelite is chosen to be a mouthpiece? No. An individual person, Isaiah, was chosen to be a mouthpiece, an instrument. King David was chosen to be a king and one of the authors of Scripture. Not every Israelite was chosen for that instrumental purpose. And so you've got to understand, when we're talking about election, as we go through in our other articles, we're talking about different choices that God makes in his redemptive plan throughout history. He chooses a nation. He chooses individuals from that nation to be messengers, prophets, and apostles. He chooses the message to go first to the Jew and then later to the Gentile. And so that's a choice of who he's sending the message to. And then also you've got the choice to bestow mercy upon whom he wants to bestow mercy. Sometimes Calvinists will quote those verses like, God can have mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, as if that's a point with which we would contend. Of course, God can have mercy on whom he wants to have mercy. It's just not a secret as to who he wants to show mercy. It's those who come clothed in the right wedding garments, who are clothed in the righteousness of Christ through faith, who humble themselves and confess their sins. God chooses to show them mercy. God chooses to show them grace. That's a choice of God. All of those are choices of God with regard to redemption and throughout redemption history. And you can't ignore any of the choices in order to understand Paul's purpose when he's talking about the doctrine of election.
So if we start with the instrumental character of election in the Old Testament, it sheds fresh light on the topic of election in the New Testament. Think of Romans 9 through 11, a central passage in the debate over unconditional election. Notice throughout that Paul's understanding of election is marked by extensive Old Testament allusions and quotations, which suggests that his understanding of the doctrine of election stands in continuity with what we've already seen in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis. The whole of Romans 9 through 11 is about how God is at work through Israel, Abraham's family, to bring the Messiah into the world and to bring the gospel to the nations. Paul is concerned to show how God's purposes in his choice of Israel, his election of Israel. Paul makes this point with the statement, those who were not my people, I will call my people. Her who was not beloved, I will call beloved. In other words, God will incorporate the reprobate nations into his sovereignly elected people.
Okay, so notice the first point he makes there, a point that people like James White says, no, you don't need to run. This is quote, by the way, in his debate with Steve Tassi. He said, don't run off into the Old Testament in order to find the interpretation. Instead, he says, you must look at the apostolic interpretation, which for Dr. White, what does that mean is my interpretation, the Calvinistic interpretation. And it's begging the question to think that Paul is interpreting the Old Testament eisegetically in order to uphold this new doctrine that's being inspired in the New Testament. there's nothing which even suggests that God is inspiring Paul to reinterpret Old Testament passages to support and hold up this new doctrine of election. And instead, we would agree with Dr. O'Reilly here that I think the 13 times, if I'm not mistaken, that he quotes from the Old Testament passages just in chapter 9 are all congruent with what he's teaching in Romans 9. In other words, there's nothing contradictory in those interpretations of the original passages with what Paul is attempting to communicate to the church in Rome. And when somebody comes along and says, oh, no, don't go run off to the Old Testament passages to try to understand what they meant in that time, because that'll just confuse you. Instead, just listen to me and let me tell you what Paul means when he quotes from Exodus 32 and 33. Let me just tell you what he means when he quotes from those Old Testament passages versus understanding what Paul and the readers of his day, the people who are actually reading this, they would have known about the Old Testament doctrines of election. And if you understand those verses in their original context, there's no reason to walk away with a Calvinistic interpretation. It has no grounding. You understand where Paul's coming from because you understand the doctrine in its original context, which many people fail to do in our culture today because they don't want to take the time to do good hermeneutics, to go through the whole context of a passage of scripture in order to understand its original intentions.
Paul also draws attention to the instrumental role of Israel in bringing the gospel to the Gentile nations by explaining how that involves Israel's surprising rejection of the Messiah, with the result that the message begins to extend beyond her national borders. This is in Romans 11. Not only that, Paul further claims that God will use the salvation of the nations instrumentally to nurture a desire among Israel to be reincorporated into the people of God.
Now, did you catch that? Remember, we've talked about that before with Romans 11, when he says they have stumbled. It's talking about the hardened Israelites. They have stumbled, but not beyond recovery. Okay, well, can a reprobate under the Calvinistic system recover? No. So we know that those hardened and stumbling are not the reprobate of the Calvinistic worldview. So that immediately wipes out Calvinism in chapter 9. So those who are hardened and stumbling have not stumbled beyond recovery. And you want to talk about individuals? Let's talk about individuals, Calvinists. Let's look at an individual hardened, stumbling Jew. According to Paul, he has not stumbled beyond recovery. Therefore, he could not be a reference to somebody unconditionally chosen for reprobation prior to the foundation of the world. That's impossible interpretation if you understand Romans 11 and its context. And so they've stumbled, but not beyond recovery. And he says, I hold out hope for their salvation, that my ministry to the Gentiles might provoke them to envy. In other words, my ministry is an instrument and to the Israelite people, because if the Gentile people begin to change and begin to adopt this worldview of Christianity and following God, and their lives change, and these prostitutes now become faithful wives and mothers, and these tax collectors start giving 4 times what they took from these people back to them, like Zacchaeus did, then the Jews are going to start looking at that and they're going to go, wait a second, look at the change that's taking place in those Gentiles, those barbarian Gentiles. Maybe there's something to this Paul's gospel, this Jesus gospel, this Christian, these little Christ running around. Maybe there's something to that, and they will be provoked to envy because they'll want something that's real, that really changes people's lives, like what they're experiencing with the gospel among the Gentiles. And so what Dr. O'Reilly is rightly pointing out here is that the instrumentality of God's ministry through the Gentile people, through the Israelite people to the Gentile nations, will actually be an instrument to help bring even those hardened Jews back into right fellowship so that they too may be grafted back in.
Along with the nations. Do you see Paul's thought flow? The nations that Paul is describing are the very families of the earth that were passed over in God's choice of Abraham's family. Now, through the ministry of Paul, the Jew, the blessing of salvation is coming to the reprobate nations. They are being incorporated into the number of the elect. And in an unexpected but not unthinkable turn of events, God will use the election of the reprobate nations as the means to the end of the re-election of Israel. The nations have become participants in the mission to return the blessing of God's salvation to the people of Israel who had been cut off due to their rejection of the Messiah.
Okay, so he just said,
Faith.
he just said,
Calvin.
He just said in a much more intelligent way the thing I just explained to you, in a much more concise way. And so make sure you're following that. I think I may have started him over on accident. Apologize here, just one second.
Calvinists respond by insisting that divine election in a very different direction from the way the Bible. Extensive Old Testament allusions and quotations, which suggests that his understanding of the doctrine of election stands in continuity with what we've already seen in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis. The whole of Romans 9 through 11 is about how God is at work through Israel, Abraham's family, to bring the Messiah into the world and to bring the gospel to the nations. Paul is concerned to show how God's purposes in his choice of Israel, his election of Israel. Paul makes this point with the statement, "Those who were not my people, I will call my people. Her who was not beloved, I will call beloved." In other words, God will incorporate the reprobate nations into his sovereignly elected people. Paul also draws attention to the instrumental role of Israel in bringing the gospel to the Gentile nations by explaining how that involves Israel's surprising rejection of the Messiah, with the result that the message begins to extend beyond her national borders. This is in Romans 11. Not only that, Paul further claims that God will use the salvation of the nations instrumentally to nurture a desire among Israel to be reincorporated into the people of God along with the nations. Do you see Paul's thought flow? The nations that Paul is describing are the very families of the earth that were passed over in God's choice of Abraham's family. Now, through the ministry of Paul, the Jew, the blessing of salvation is coming to the reprobate nations. They are being incorporated into the number of the elect. And in an unexpected but not unthinkable turn of events, God will use the election of the reprobate nations as the means to the end of the re-election of Israel. The nations have become participants in the mission to return the blessing of God's salvation to the people of Israel who had been cut off due to their rejection of the Messiah.
Okay, so with all those things in mind, let's look over at Romans 11, because I think that'll help really solidify what he's saying. Going over to 11, let me just make this a little bigger for those that are watching. There we go. Okay, hopefully y'all can see that on the screen okay, along with the advertisements that pop up. He goes, say, I've kept for myself, let's start in verse 4, I've kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed a knee to Baal. Now, let me just ask you this question. Has he kept them unconditionally, or has he kept them because they refuse to bow a knee to Baal and they believe in God? In other words, even in the face of death, these people are unwilling to bow a knee to Baal. Couldn't that be the reason that he's kept them for himself? So sometimes Calvinists read this passage and they think, oh, well, that means God unconditionally elected these people, thus causing them not to bow a knee to Baal. Well, it's question begging. You'd have to assume your interpretation. It seems to me that he's keeping them because of their faithfulness, not he's making them faithful so as to keep them. Otherwise, why not just make everyone more faithful? And so keep that in mind. That's what he's talking about here, the remnant that he has chosen, not unconditionally, but because of their faithfulness, their unwillingness to bow a knee to Baal. In the same way, then, there's also come to be a present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. Now, again, don't assume that God's gracious choice here is an unconditional choice before they are ever born. But it's a remnant according to God's gracious choice of who? Those who believe. It doesn't mean it's a gracious choice of people who are perfect or have fulfilled the demands of God's law. No, because all have fallen short with regard to God's law. But they're remnant according to God's gracious choice, because even people who don't bow a knee to Baal need grace. In other words, just because you haven't bowed a knee to Baal doesn't mean you don't need the grace of God. Yeah, they're faithful, but they still need grace. They're still sinners. And so it's a gracious choice for God to keep them and still to show them love and forgiveness, even though they have refused to bow a knee to Baal. God doesn't owe them that. It's still a gracious choice. But if it's by grace, it's no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. And so notice it's not based upon their works. It's based upon their faith. They trusted in God. It's not based upon how well they followed the law and the commandments. It's based upon the fact that they trusted in God rather than other gods. What Israel is seeking, it is not obtained, but those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. So those who are chosen obtained it. What's it talking about? This is a reflection back on chapter 9 in verses 30 and following, when he says, well, Israel, what they're pursuing, they're not attaining it. Why? Because they're running and willing after it. They're trying to attain it through the law. But the Gentiles who are pursuing it through faith, they are attaining it. And so who are the chosen who have obtained it? Those who are running by faith, those who believe through Christ, through the promise of God. And so those are the chosen. So don't just assume when you see the word chosen that that's some kind of unconditional choice before the foundation of the world for no apparent reason. No, it's chosen based upon the fact that they believe in God, not on the basis of them running and willing after the ways of the law or the ways of the flesh. And so the rest, notice it talks about the rest were hardened. Now, what this oftentimes is set up in the dichotomy of the Calvinistic system, it's set up as the chosen are the elect, unconditionally elected before the foundation of the world, and the rest are the reprobate, the hardened ones, the ones that God didn't choose before the foundation of the world. So you got these two people being introduced in verse 7, the chosen, the elect, unconditionally elected, and the reprobate, those that are destined to hell forever separated from God. Okay, so let's see if that interpretation of the Calvinistic dichotomy here bears itself out as you continue to read, because look what happens to the rest. In other words, he's about to show who the rest are. Okay, so let's look at the rest who were hardened. Okay, just as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor. So who did he give a spirit of stupor to? The rest who were hardened. Now, to give somebody a spirit of stupor, what does that mean? It's kind of like Pharaoh. He hardened him. What does harden mean? To strengthen somebody in the rebellion. To harden somebody, some people use that as a proof text for Calvinism. To say, oh, look, God's hardening them, therefore Calvinism must be true. No, it actually proves the opposite. If divine sovereign, if EDD is true, what we call the exhaustive divine determinism is true, then what is God to harden? There's no reason to harden somebody you're already meticulously controlling. Okay, the fact that he's hardening or strengthening Pharaoh in his resolve actually proves our position, because it's showing that there's a will to be hardened. Otherwise, he's just hardening something he has already divinely inspired, or he's somehow divinely decreed to be what it is, and that makes no sense. And so the fact that he's hardening Pharaoh is the same thing he's doing to the people of Israel who are calloused and hardened in their rebellion. So he gives them a spirit of stupor, eyes that cannot see, ears that to this very day hear not to this very day. So this is a condition of Israelites who have grown calloused and hardened in their rebellion, which is a parallel passage of one we look at quite regularly in Acts chapter 28, verses 3 through 28, where he clearly talks about the reason that some were not convinced, some wouldn't come after he preached to them all day long, is because they've grown calloused and hardened. They've closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see, hear, turn, and understand, and I would heal them, God says. Therefore, I take the message to the Gentiles. They'll listen. He contrasts the Jews who won't listen because of their calloused rebellion with the Gentiles who will listen, not because they're less sinful. They're more sinful. They're more immoral, but they'll listen because they have not grown hardened and calloused in their rebellion. So God give them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they cannot see down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not and bend their backs forever. I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? Who is they? Okay, who is they? Who are the stumblers that he's talking about here? Who are those that stumble? The same people up here in verse 7, the rest. So the rest who were hardened is who he's describing in verses 8, 9, and 10, and then right into 11. So if they're stumbling, hardened stumblers with spirits of stupor, and they have not stumbled beyond recovery, then they are not the reprobate of Calvinism. They can't be, because it's possible for them to be saved. So you want to talk about individuals who are stumbling and have a spirit of stupor. If they have stumbled but not as to fall beyond recovery, then they cannot be what the Calvinists think they are. So keep that in mind. If their transgression is riches for the world and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? This is the instrumentality that Dr. O'Reilly is talking about. Look at what's going to happen when the Gentiles come into the covenant with God through faith. Look what's going to happen whenever the Jews see this and they come back. But I'm speaking to you are Gentiles, inasmuch as that I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I might magnify my ministry, if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. So this is soteriological in nature. He's hoping to save some of the rest who were hardened, those who stumbled but not beyond recovery. He's hoping to see them what? Saved. How? Through the instrumentality of being provoked by the ministry to the Gentiles when they see the lives change in the Gentiles and they think, I want to have that. I want what they have. Jealousy, envy is going to provoke that with them, something that would be superfluous if effectual regeneration is at work. Verse 15, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, now what's that talking about? If their rejection, who's that? Israel. If Israel's rejection, in other words, crucify him. If their rejection is what brings the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? In other words, if these same people who rejected the Messiah come back, think of the willingness of God to bring life to them from the dead. If the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also, and if the root is holy, the branches are too. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them and become partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it's not you who supports the root, but the root who supports you. In other words, Gentiles, don't get arrogant here. You're the wild olive branch being grafted into the native root, the Israelite nation, the people, the revelation, the covenant. Okay. Branches were broken off so that you might say then, well, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Quite right. So he's not disagreeing with that. In other words, Israelites have been broken off in their unbelief so as to graft in the believers, the Gentile nations. Quite right. They were broken off for unbelief. Now stop right here. Why were they broken off? Because they were unconditionally elected for reprobation before the world began for no apparent reason, just before they did anything good or bad, like Esau is interpreted back in Romans 9. No, it says they're broken off for a reason, for their unbelief. That's their fault. It's their doing. They closed their eyes, according to the scriptures. God didn't, eyes aren't already born closed. According to Acts 28, they closed their eyes. And so, but you stand by your faith. So how do they stand? Oh, well, these guys must be Pelagian because they called it your faith. They didn't call it God's faith or God's effectual work of faith. No, you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. It's not removing the fear because God doesn't owe even faithful people anything. Please hear this. Just because you're faithful doesn't mean God owes you salvation. God chooses to show grace to those who believe. Do not be conceited, but fear, for if the God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. In other words, if he cuts off Israel for their unbelief, would he not cut off the Gentiles for their unbelief too? Behold, then, is the kindness and severity of God to those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise you will also be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and were grafted contrary to the nature into the cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? And so I hope you can see through the interpretation here that Paul is not contrasting the reprobates versus the elect from the Calvinistic perspective. Otherwise, the reprobates would have no hope of being grafted back into the vine and be provoked to envy and to be saved. And so with that in mind, let's go back to Dr. O'Reilly's video here.
In the end, Paul's doctrine of election means that Jews and Gentiles all stand together on equal footing as members of Abraham's family by grace through faith in Jesus. So we've seen that election in the Bible is not simply about being the object of God's blessing. It's also about becoming the instrument by which that blessing is extended to the nations.
Did you catch that? Really, really important. Let me go back just a little bit because that's really valuable. Listen.
Jesus. So we've seen that election in the Bible is not simply about being the object of God's blessing. It's also about becoming the instrument by which that blessing is extended to the nations. We should note that this.
Okay, so just hear that. So it's not just about being chosen to receive blessings from God. The choice of Israel was not just so, hey, I'm going to just give you great blessings and give you land and other things. Remember, he did that to the Edomites too. He did that to the Ishmaelites. Remember, he gave them land and external blessings. He gave them common provisions until they attacked Israel, and then he removed those things, if you recall. And so it's not just about being blessed with these blessings, external blessings, but it's about being chosen to be the instrument through which the greatest blessing of all would come, and that is the Messiah. Salvation would come through this seed, through this nation. And that is not to the neglect of all the nations, but it's for the sake of all the other nations. That's the point that you have to catch in order to understand why Calvinism has failed to understand Romans 9 through 11.
This framing of the doctrine is complementary, really supports the Wesleyan Arminian perspective that election to salvation is conditional, because the reprobate nations are incorporated into the elect people of God by grace on the condition of faith in Jesus. More importantly, we must not fail to see that election is at heart a missional doctrine. It is the doctrine that says God has chosen us for a purpose, and that purpose is to take the gospel of Jesus Christ to those who have not yet experienced the joy of God's salvation. The people of God are chosen for the explicit purpose of being the instrument by which God will bless all the nations of the earth. And as the unbelieving nations come to faith in Jesus Christ, and the reprobate are incorporated into the elect people of God, they too become missional instruments for the advance of the gospel. So taken in biblical perspective, the doctrine of election should always motivate us to mission. Mission is the end of election, because God has chosen us to be the agents of his blessing, to fill the earth with the knowledge of his glory.
Isn't that beautiful? I love that. Dr. O'Reilly, if you're still watching, which I hope you are, God bless you for that, man. That was just powerful. That'll preach right there. And if you don't believe that's what his overall goal is, go back to Romans 10. If you don't think that that's what Paul's about, look how he starts Romans 10. Brethren, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for them, speaking of Israel, is for their salvation. This is a mission-minded passage here. If you think this is just about God choosing certain types of people from all the nations of the world, this percentage of people, to the neglect of all the other people of the world, then you're missing the heart of Paul here. Any kind of doctrine that pits Paul and his heart against God and his heart is a wrong doctrine. It's demonstrably wrong, because what you have in Romans 9, according to the Calvinist, is God expressing some kind of a desire to reprobate most of his own people, the Israelites, who are hardened in their rebellion. And what you hear from the heart of Paul in the very next chapter is that his heart's desire and his prayer is for their salvation. Well, is Paul more merciful than the one who's inspiring him to write these words? Remember, this is the same apostle who in the chapter 9, 1 through 3, said, I would be willing to curse myself for the sake of the salvation of my kinsmen, according to the flesh, my Israelite friends, my brothers. I would take hell for their salvation if that were possible. That's ultimately what he says. Is his love more self-sacrificial than that of Christ, who only, quote unquote, died for the elect, according to Calvinism? Of course not. Any doctrinal system that pits the apostle's heart against the heart of the one inspiring the apostle must be a false teaching. It must be a false doctrine. It's coming to the wrong conclusions. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God is for their salvation. And he goes on to quote from a passage that we often look to out of Deuteronomy, which says, these things are not too far from you, not too difficult for you. He's right there with you, and that he may be known. But I want you to see the bookmark of chapter 10, what he quotes in verse 21 of chapter 10. But as for Israel, he, being God, so this is speaking about God, says this. So you got Paul's words, and now you got God's words, okay? All day long, I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people, to Israel, okay? So the imagery here of this prophecy is of God stretching out his arms, mission-minded. Okay, this is missions here. This is God longing to gather these rebellious people, much like a mother hen longing to gather their chicks under her wings. During a time of fire, chickens were known to gather the baby chicks under the wings and save them from the fire. That's the imagery of Jesus in Matthew. Longs to gather them, longs holding out his hands to them. And this is a display of long suffering or patience, where God is patient, bearing with them, long suffering with them, longing to gather them, waiting on them. What's he waiting on? His sovereign decree? Is he waiting on some effectual work of generation just to change their hearts? No, he's waiting on them to come to him. He's waiting on them to reach their pigsty in hopes that they will turn and be forgiven. And so all day long, he stretches out his hands despite their disobedience and obstinance. He's not divinely ordaining their disobedience and obstinance and just pretending like he wants them to change, but really he holds the key, and the only key that can cause them to change effectually, because they were born with some condition that they couldn't control, but hating him. Nothing like that's in any of these passages. That's completely read onto by the Calvinistic worldview. I wanted you to see this from some other robust, deep theological teachers like Dr. O'Reilly, who are teaching these kinds of things in, I think, a very clear and concise way. And he does a really good job in this 10-minute video. And like I said, I put it in the show notes. If you haven't liked Dr. O'Reilly's Orthodoxy for Everyone, his YouTube page, go like it. Subscribe to it. Now, I don't know a lot of what else Dr. O'Reilly teaches. I haven't checked on a lot of the other things that he teaches. And so I'll be getting to know him as well. So I'm not endorsing everything he ever says or writes, because I don't know what he says or writes. And I'm sure he would say the same about me. He doesn't know everything I've said or write. So we might not agree with each other. But that's one of the great things about what we can do as brothers and sisters in Christ, is to recognize we have disagreements with each other, but we can still disagree with each other without being overly disagreeable and without being contentious about these things. Notice that Dr. O'Reilly's video is not overly contentious towards Calvinists or any individual Calvinist. He doesn't call any of them names. He doesn't belittle them. He doesn't laugh at their scholarship or talk down to them or anything like that. He just simply takes them on by looking at the text and showing that the heart of God in Romans 9-11 is about the expanding of his mercy and grace to all the nations of the earth, not about a narrowing of it to a certain select few that were chosen for reasons beyond our control before the world ever began. And when we begin to understand this, we begin to highlight the goodness of God's mercy and his love. And we begin to celebrate what Romans 9-11 says, not try to be stealth about it or to hide it from our parishioners because we're embarrassed about the way it makes God look. And I think that's why it's so important for us to understand these doctrines rightly, and as apologists especially, to help the world who's questioning whether our doctrines are believable or coherent, to help them to understand God's not contradicting himself. He's not contradicting other passages of scripture which seem to indicate he wants the salvation of every person, while over here talking about how he only dies for a select few and really effectually calls a select few. There's no reason to adopt these seemingly contradictory worldviews when the scriptures hermeneutically just don't support the Calvinistic teaching. That's where a lot of those who claim the name Calvinist have landed, is that they've just come to the point of saying something like, well, it's just two parallel lines that meet in eternity. It's just true. Yes, God deterministically controls everything, especially with regard to the choice of whether you accept or reject him. He's the one who's ultimately in control of that choice. But at the same time, you're still free, and you're still able to make that choice. And it's really your choice, and it's a real choice, and it's yours. And if you want to follow him, you can, you should. And those seem like contradictions, maybe, and they are. But you know what? We're just humans, and we just can't understand the divine, and we're just not able to comprehend it. But both of them are true. Yes, God is deterministically controlling that, but yes, you are free and responsible. And those are just two tensions that we just will never begin to explain. And they'll say things like that, and I understand what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is not have to grapple with Romans 9-11 in a way that explains it rightly, so as to deal with the contradictory terminology. But there's no reason to hold to this contradictory tension, because there is no contradiction here when you understand the intention of the author and what he's getting to. And so people who have taken that two rails meeting eternity type of perspective are people who are trying to be genuine with the text. They're trying, and they've come to the point where they've just said, well, I guess the Bible does teach Calvinism in these verses, and it teaches Arminianism in these verses, and I'll just hold the tension of both of them being true. And when I'm preaching out of Romans 9 through 11, I'll preach like a Calvinist. And when I'm preaching out of John 3:16 or 1 Timothy 2:4 or 2 Peter 3:9 or Ezekiel 18 or the dozens of other passages, then I'll sound like an Arminian, and I'll just say, guys, it's just an inconsistent, seemingly inconsistent worldview, but it's not really inconsistent. It just seems that way to us, and call it an antinomy or a paradox like J.I. Packer does, and then just live with that tension, so to speak. You don't need to live with that tension. Not if you do good hermeneutics and go to the text like we just saw Dr. O'Reilly do, and show from looking at the Old Testament text what Paul is referring to when talking about the election of Abraham, the election of the nations, as not being to the neglect of the rest of the nations, but for the spreading of the news of the goodness of who God is to those nations. And so I hope this is helpful to you. I pray that as we continue to spread the news of God's love and grace, that we will continue to be gracious in the way that we do that. I hope that's clear when I say that. That too many times I see on YouTube and other places, not only Calvinists being ungracious and unkind to non-Calvinists, I'm seeing more and more, I'm seeing non-Calvinist or provisionist or traditionalist or Arminians be very unkind and ungracious towards Calvinists. And recently it was posted, and I'll address this issue because it came up in the side chat too earlier. Somebody asked, why, Dr. Flowers, won't you address Calvinists more harshly and more firmly? In fact, it was one of this was on the comments on my Facebook page. And I get that comment occasionally, but on this particular comment, there were a bunch of likes with it. In other words, it's not just one person. A lot of times, if you just see one person make a comment and there's nobody who likes it or shares it or anything else, and you just think, well, that was just an individual that just shared their opinion. But this person shared his opinion, and then there's a bunch of likes on it too, which is ultimately, Leighton, why don't you come down more harshly on the Calvinist teaching, false doctrine, being heretics, being outside the church, and all those kinds of things. I've answered this before on other videos, but let me just say it again for those who are listening now, and let me help you understand why I address Calvinists in the way that I do. One is I was a Calvinist for 10 years of my life. I was not unsaved during those 10 years. I genuinely believed in Jesus Christ. I genuinely trusted in him for my salvation. I was sincere. I was a missionary. I was on the mission field when I became a Calvinist and continue to go to the mission field as a Calvinist. I know that the heart of a Calvinist is not an unbelieving heart, because I have witnessed it myself. Now, does that mean that there are some people who adhere to Calvinism who are possibly unsaved? Yes. And even John Piper talks about how people can adopt a worldview or a systematic and not truly be regenerate, not truly be saved. And so, yes, there's people on both sides of this divide who are probably not true believers or true Christians, who are wolves in sheep clothing and all those kinds of things. And so I'm not speaking about every single individual and every single situation. I'm talking generally speaking. Most Calvinistic brothers and sisters are just that, brothers and sisters who have a false understanding, or they're misinformed about what certain passages teach and believe, and what the original author was intending to say in those passages. And they're doing so with good intentions. Wow, that was got my notifications on apparently. I guess everybody heard that. So people are listening. Oh, I got a notification. My ear is still ringing on that one. Turn down the volume. So let me just remind you that when we're addressing Calvinists, what we're doing is we're saying, Calvinists, we believe that you believe in Jesus and you're trusting in him for your salvation. we disagree with what you say about Romans 9. We disagree with how you interpret Acts 13:48, for example, or Ephesians 1 with regard to predestination. We think that philosophically you've misinterpreted those passages, and theologically you've deduced the wrong conclusion. But we still love you, and we don't like your Calvinism, but we like you. For the most part, we think that you have a lot of good things to say, and we agree with much of what you say. We just disagree with what conclusion you come to. And the illustration I've used before is, with my own children, if my children are trying to clean up the house real quick before mom and dad come home from it, maybe we had a date night, and they're saying, hey, it's getting close to Valentine's Day, and let's just do something nice for mom and dad. Let's clean up the house real quick. And in the effort to clean up the house real quick, one of them hits their elbow against the lamp and knocks it over and breaks the lamp. And it's an expensive, nice lamp that that my wife had bought, and it was really something special to us. And we get home and we find out what happened. And we see that they try to clean up the house for us really nice, but one of them accidentally knocked over the lamp. Okay, are we going to be upset? Yeah, we're going to be upset. We're going to tell them to be more careful, those kinds of things. But the kind of punishment in that situation is going to be much different than if we, for example, would tell the kids, well, hey guys, it's time to put things away and go to bed. And one of them goes, no, I don't want to go to bed. And he pushes the lamp over in anger. The punishment's going to be much different in those two situations. Both of them result in a broken lamp, and that's bad. Okay, so I'm not trying to say one of them's not bad and one of them's good. Both of them result in the same thing. It's a broken lamp. Well, both Calvinists with good intentions and Calvinists maybe with not so good intentions, it results in the same thing. It's a broken lamp. It's a broken doctrine. It's false. It's a false teaching. But the way I address those two different folks are two different ways of addressing somebody. And somebody just intentionally trying to mislead people out of selfish ambitions or vain conceit or pride or lust or something of that nature is much different than somebody who's intentionally trying to interpret God rightly and understand his doctrine rightly. I believe from the bottom of my heart, John Piper, for example, or John MacArthur is maybe another example. I believe with the bottom of my heart, I believe they are well-intending in their effort to explain the scriptures the way it teaches. They believe in Jesus Christ. They believe and trust in him for their salvation. They misinterpret certain passages of scriptures to come to a wrong conclusion. And therefore, when I address them, I address the broken lamp, but I address it as people who broke that lamp unintentionally, with good intentions, trying to do the right thing. That is a difference. Trust me when I say this. As the top of the website says, it is through kindness of speech comes education, comes proper education. In other words, you will persuade more people through honey, not vinegar, right? Okay, Proverbs teaches that. It's a scripture verse that's teaching us that you will win more people over through respect and kindness than through vitriolic name calling and browbeating. That's just bottom line truth. Okay. Does that mean that if I don't shout down people in anger and yell out and call them heretics and cast them out of the kingdom because I supposedly know their heart and I can tell whether they truly have faith or not, that somehow I am not as firm in my conviction as someone else who's doing that. So in other words, you've got one guy over here who's yelling at the Calvinists with angry face, red face, and they're mean and they're angry and they're calling them heretics. Get out of here. Is that person more convicted than Leighton Flowers is of the brokenness of the lamp or the wrongness of the doctrine? No. I just think I'm going to do a lot better job convincing Calvinistic friends to come over to my side and to understand they've broken the lamp. And I'm going to restore that child into right relationship with me instead of casting them out of my house because they broke a lamp. Do you see what I'm trying to say? Hopefully, again, you may not agree with me. You may want to take a different approach. But my calling and my ministry, I know what God has laid on my heart to do. I know what I need to do in order to have the best possible chance of reaching somebody with the doctrine of God's provision for all people. And if you don't believe in that, if you don't like that direction, in other words, if you don't like the way I'm doing it, then that's okay. Go somewhere else. There are a lot of other videos and people out there who do that kind of thing. who yell at Calvinists and call them heretics and all that. Go give them money, go join them, go do what you want to do with them if you want to. Okay, you get the free will to do that, right? Don't come onto my website and start invoking your way of winning Calvinists over, or people who are on the fence, or people who are questioning these things, onto my ministry websites and the things that I'm trying to do. God bless you, but that's not my goal. And if you're a giver, and if you're a Patreon, or you're somebody patron who gives in one of these areas, and you don't like that I'm not more firm with that, and you want to withhold your funds, God bless you. That's fine with me. You go give your money somewhere else if you want to. I'm not beholden to anybody. I'm not trying to upset anybody by not being more vitriolic and mean towards Calvinists. I have learned through the Facebook messages, through the emails, through the phone calls from, yes, I've had phone calls from Calvinistic PhDs teaching in seminaries, calling me on the phone and thanking me for the way that I've treated them, and even saying they are honestly considering other perspectives because of the way that I've addressed these situations. In other words, I'm going to have a lot more inroads in reaching people who are still questioning these doctrines, who are open to the Spirit of God to teach them, lead them in the right interpretations, by addressing them with respect and love, not with anger and vitriolic rage. I'm not always perfectly successful in my efforts to do that. Sometimes I have slipped and I've apologized. You guys would be interested to know that there's times I've deleted videos before posting them because I thought, that did not come across in the right spirit. There are times where I have deleted posts on Facebook posts, retracted comments. There are times, at least 2 or 3 I can think of, where I've contacted somebody personally and apologized to them for the way I came across in a conversation with them. Or so I'm not perfect in this regard at all. I fail, I mess up. I think we all have the tendency of being able to step into the muck and the mire on those situations. But I'm just saying these things for those of you who I know who are regular listeners, who like the broadcast, who appreciate the things that I'm doing, but who would like for me to be, quote unquote, more firm or more harsh maybe, or call a spade, that kind of a thing. I understand where you're coming from. I understand I understand this. Let me put it this way. One of the men who wrote that on there, I found out through some other emails, some other messages, looking through some of the messages, that this person's church of 30, 40 years that he grew up in hired a pastor who didn't tell the committee that he was Calvinistic. He told him he wasn't Calvinistic, in fact, but that was really Reformed, but just didn't like the name Calvinistic. And so he said, no, I'm not a Calvinist. I'm not a Calvinist. I'm not Calvinistic, but was, by all definitions of the term, did support a tulip doctrine. Let's just put it that way. And ended up splitting his home church. And he was one of the people that was in the leadership who tried to stand up against it, and he lost his church. He ended up having to leave his church of 30, 40 years that he grew up in, that he loved, helped build, literally through financials and through actually getting out there and helping to build this building. I helped to split a church when I was a Calvinist, and hurt a pastor and a lot of people when I went through that process. And so I was on the other end of that. And so I've never been in a church that was split by a Calvinist before, especially a church that I loved and was a part of for many years of my life and emotionally invested in. I've not experienced that before. And so I say what I'm saying with the knowledge that there are people who have experienced a great amount of emotional devastation and loss. One couple I'm thinking of, who I recently talked to, just virtually in tears, talking about their son, who has quote unquote been swept up into Calvinism and now won't even talk to him anymore. And when he does talk to him, he's very angry with them, and he's mean with them, and it's like they feel like he's kind of joined a cult of some sort. And you can imagine the emotion that parents, and I haven't had that. I mean, my 4 children, none of them have adopted a Calvinistic worldview or split ways with me because of my Calvinism or their Calvinism and my lack thereof. I've not gone through that. And so why the reason I'm pointing that out is that circumstances and experiences can greatly impact how we address a particular situation. But let me just tell you, there are some quote unquote Calvinistic pastors who would be just as angry as you are in that stealth pastor who came in and split that church over Calvinism. There are some Calvinistic pastors who actually stand up against young Calvinists doing that kind of thing. And so that's not just about Calvinism in general. That's about an individual Calvinist doing something wrong and sinful to you. And you've got to be careful of bigotry and doing broad brushes and just thinking, okay, that Calvinist did that to me, therefore all Calvinists are like that. It's not true. Well, look at what John Calvin did to Servetus. Therefore, all Calvinists are like John Calvin. Really? That's just not true. That's more of a stereotype, and we don't like that. We don't like when people do that with skin colors or with certain ethnic groups or something of that nature. We shouldn't do that towards theological groups either. Just assuming that somebody that's from a theological group must be an angry, mean kind of guy that's just going to completely demolish the church because I happen to know a Calvinist that was like that. I remember one guy talking about, I knew a Calvinist in seminary and he's selling cars now. And as if to say, well, if you ever become a Calvinist, you'll never last in ministry. You'll end up selling cars. No, that's not reasonable either. And so when we're addressing the situation, it's what I'm asking you to do is to remove yourself as much as possible from the negative experience you've had with a particular Calvinist in order to address Calvinism and not to become overly vitriolic towards any particular Calvinist. Though I'm well aware of the fact that some of the Calvinists on our web sites and on Facebook pages can be very mean and vitriolic, but so can some of us. To be honest with it, be honest. So can some of us. And that's what I'm trying to stand up against and say, we have got to, if we have any chance of winning over people to the heart of the truthfulness of what we believe about God's grace, and we've got to act like the God we believe in. We've got to act like the Jesus we believe in. And the Jesus we believe in dies for his enemies and loves his enemies and doesn't pass by on the other side of the road of his enemies. He stops and helps them. And that's true whether you're talking about salvific issues and helping the atheist. And it's also true about within the church body of helping your brothers and sisters who've fallen into a ditch theologically. And your willingness to be patient with them, to be long suffering towards them, to stop and to help them, to give them an ear, to show them unconditional love, even though they hold a doctrine that you don't believe in. So am I saying you shouldn't stand firm on what you believe is true? It's not what I'm saying at all. I think you should stand firm on what you believe is true. I think you should stand firm about what you believe about Romans 9 through 11. I think you should stand firm in sharing the books and videos of men like Dr. O'Reilly. I think you should be firm in standing up in your church and saying, I love you, brothers, but this is what I believe Paul is saying in this passage, and give your opinion with firm conviction, but do so with an attitude and a heart of love. And you will, I think, go much further in your efforts to win people over when you do that. And so there was some other questions in the side chat, but I've gone long and I think I've answered several of them, and that's all I'm going to take time for at this time. I appreciate those who've watched and tuned in. I appreciate those who continue to support and to give and to help make this a reality. And keep doing what you're doing. Keep giving as you have the opportunity and the abilities. Never take away from obviously your local giving, your tithe, or the funds that you need for your own ministry or your own families. But if in above and beyond, God grants you the ability to help us spread the news of God's love and provision, then please join us and click on the support link in the top right corner at Soteriology 101. I've recently opened up the membership here on YouTube. It hasn't been approved yet, but you can also become a member of the YouTube page, and that helps us through promoting the channel to more people. And so more we can get the word out through sharing and liking the videos, it really makes a little difference. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that right now, and share this video and others that come out with people as you have an opportunity to. So hopefully that's been helpful. Feel free to post in the side chat if you have questions or other videos or things that you would like for me to answer. And I will try to do that maybe in further videos and future videos. God bless. See you next time. Bye-bye.